Humanity recorded its first official defeat in the Galactic archives on a quiet cycle that most alien historians barely remembered at the time. A brief entry noting that a minor human task force had been overwhelmed and forced to retreat from the border system known as Lareth Reach, a system claimed by the Kethari Dominion and considered unimportant by every major power. And the council chambers on Virex Prime treated the report as confirmation of what they already believed, that humans were stubborn but ultimately weak, adaptable but lacking the depth, patience, and scale needed to survive among ancient star empires. And when the news reached Earth, the public story matched the Galactic one closely enough. With officials speaking of tragic miscalculation, of brave crews lost, of lessons learned, and of a need for restraint, while diplomats worked to prevent further escalation. But behind closed doors, the tone was different, quieter, more precise, and far more deliberate, because the defeat at Lareth Reach had never been meant to be avoided, and the men and women who planned it understood exactly how it would look outside eyes, how it would ripple through alien intelligence networks, how it would reshape threat assessments and strategic models that had already underestimated humanity for decades. And Admiral Daniel Harper stood in the dim command center beneath the Pacific, hands clasped behind his back as holographic replays of the battle looped silently, watching the moment when the human cruisers broke formation and fell back under concentrated Kethari fire, watching the flashes that marked ships scuttle themselves exactly on schedule, and he felt no regret, only confirmation, because every second of that engagement had unfolded within acceptable parameters, every loss already accounted for, every signal already captured by listening arrays hidden far beyond the system. And around him officers waited, not tense but focused, as if observing a test, whose outcome they had predicted months in advance. And when Harper finally spoke, his voice was calm, as he said it played exactly as expected. They swallowed it whole, and Commander Alicia Grant nodded, tapping data into her console, as new intelligence packets streamed in from relay buoys seated across nearby sectors, showing increased Kethari fleet movements, internal communications filled with contempt, and recommendations from their admirals to push harder now while the humans were shaken, because the Dominion had long believed that victory was not just about firepower, but about breaking an enemy's will early. And the sight of humans retreating fed that belief perfectly. And on Virex Prime, the Galactic Council convened an emergency session at the request of the Kethari ambassador, a towering insectoid known as Threxel, who spoke with sharp confidence about restoring order to a volatile frontier, describing the humans as reckless newcomers who had trespassed into sovereign space and suffered the natural consequences. And as his words echoed to the chamber, representatives from older civilizations murmured approval, some amused, some relieved, because many of them had watched humanity's rapid technological rise with quiet unease, and a public failure made it easier to categorize them again as manageable, containable. And when the human ambassador, a middle-aged woman named Laura Mitchell, rose to respond, she did not argue the fact of defeat, did not deny the loss, did not threaten retaliation. She simply acknowledged the Council's concern, expressed regret for the escalation, and stated that Earth would review its deployments while seeking diplomatic solutions, and her measured tone further convinced the chamber that humanity had been chastened, that their brief period of boldness was ending, and that belief spread quickly through the trade routes and data nexuses of the galaxy, reaching pirate enclaves, mercenary guilds, and neutral systems that adjusted their policies accordingly, raising tariffs on human shipping, canceling joint ventures, and quietly preparing to take advantage of a species that seemed to have overreached. And on Earth, these reactions were monitored closely by teams that never slept, analysts tracking shifts in economic pressure and political alignment, feeding projections into models that showed exactly how far the ripple would go. And Colonel Marcus Hale, overseeing strategic deception operations, smiled faintly as he read a summary noting that 17 independent powers had downgraded humanity's threat rating within 48 hours, because that downgrade was a key that unlocked everything that followed, allowing human assets to move where they otherwise could not, allowing construction fleets to work without scrutiny, allowing research stations to operate under civilian cover. And far from the council chambers and command bunkers, the people of Earth mourned sincerely, because the losses at Lareth Reach were real to them. Families grieved for sons and daughters who would never return, and memorials were held in cities across the planet. And those deaths mattered deeply to the planners as well, because the trap required credibility, and credibility required sacrifice, and every volunteer had known that from the beginning, had understood that history might never know their names, that the galaxy would remember them as the first proof of human weakness. And still they had gone, trusting that the larger design justified the cost. And as weeks passed, the Kethari Dominion pressed its advantage exactly as predicted, launching probing attacks on peripheral human colonies, testing defenses, seizing outposts that had already been flagged for abandonment, and each time human forces responded slowly, cautiously, sometimes retreating again, sometimes allowing assets to be lost that could have been saved, and each apparent failure was another layer in the illusion, another data point reinforcing alien confidence. And Threxel reported to his superiors that the humans were unraveling, that their command structure lacked cohesion, that their fleets were hesitant and reactive, and those reports climbed the Dominion hierarchy until they reached the ears of Archon Velkera herself, an ancient ruler whose species had dominated its region of space for millennia, and Velkera saw in humanity an opportunity, not just for expansion but for demonstration, a chance to remind the galaxy why the Dominion's authority was absolute, and she authorized preparations for a decisive campaign, one that would push deep into human-controlled space and force Earth to accept vassal status or face annihilation. And when that authorization was transmitted, it was intercepted, decrypted, and delivered to Admiral Harper's desk within minutes. And he allowed himself a long breath, because the trap had finally closed, and he convened a secure council of his own, drawing together military, leaders, scientists, and civilian officials who had been living under layers of secrecy for years. And in that room, plans were reviewed that dwarfed anything the galaxy had ever seen. Mobilizations hidden behind a veiled defeat. Technologies withheld from public deployment. Doctrines refined through simulations that assumed worst-case scenarios, and then went further. And Dr. Ethan Cole, a quiet physicist whose work had been dismissed by alien peers as theoretical curiosity, presented readiness metrics for systems that bent space in ways the Council had outlawed centuries earlier. Systems humans had developed precisely because they had been told not to, and as the meeting progressed, the mood was not triumphant but steady, focused, because no one in that room underestimated the cost of what was coming, and above them Earth turned slowly beneath the stars, appearing small and fragile to any distant observer. And that image, too, was part of the trap, because the galaxy had always judged strength by size, by age, by visible might, and humanity had learned early that sometimes the most effective weapon was letting an enemy believe they had already won. As the Kethari Dominion finalized its campaign plans, the galaxy shifted subtly around that decision. Convoys rerouted. Minor powers aligned themselves more openly with the Dominion, and long-dormant border disputes flared as neighbors sensed that humanity was no longer a stabilizing presence. And all of it unfolded under human observation with a level of detail that would have shocked the observers themselves if they had known, because the defeat at Lareth Reach had not only lowered threat ratings but loosened information security across half a sector, and signals once encrypted behind layers of protocol were now transmitted with casual confidence. And on Luna Station, Commander Alicia Grant watched intercepted fleet manifests scroll past the console, noting how the Dominion had committed assets that normally guarded their core worlds, a sign of absolute certainty that no credible counterattack existed. And she forwarded the data to Admiral Harper with a simple note stating they were committing deeper than projected, which meant the pressure was working faster than expected. And on Earth, Colonel Marcus Hale briefed a small group of civilian leaders whose public roles were limited to economic management and humanitarian outreach, explaining calmly that the next phase would require additional restraint, more visible losses, and policies that would look like desperation to the outside world. And some of them struggled with that, questioning how much more the population could be asked to endure without understanding the reason, and Hale listened without interruption before reminding them that the illusion had to be complete, that alien cultures value consistency above all else, and that a sudden change in posture would unravel months of careful misdirection. And reluctantly they agreed, authorizing further withdrawals from marginal systems and emergency legislation that froze certain military programs in public records while their classified counterparts accelerated in silence. And as the Dominion advanced, human colonies were evacuated under the cover of civilian relocation efforts. News feeds showing images of overcrowded transports and anxious faces, reinforcing the narrative of a species in retreat. And those images circulated widely, provoking sympathy in some quarters and predatory interest in others. and pirate bands began probing human shipping lanes, discovering to their surprise that escorts were minimal and response time slow. And several high-profile raids succeeded, further cementing the perception of decline. But what none of them realized was that each raid was mapped, each pirate vessel tagged, its weapon signatures cataloged, and its crews identified, not for immediate retaliation, but for future leverage. And within the Dominion fleet, Archon Belcara received constant updates describing humanity's collapse in morale and cohesion, and she convened her war council aboard the ancient command ship Vethric Spire, its hull etched with symbols of conquests older than human civilization itself. And there, her admirals debated the final approach, some urging a direct strike on Earth to end the matter swiftly, others advocating a methodical dismantling of human infrastructure to force surrender without unnecessary expenditure, and Belcara listened patiently before deciding on a path that reflected both dominance and theater, ordering a staged advance that would crush human defensive system by system broadcasting. Each victory to the galaxy is proof of the Dominion's inevitability, and that decision, too, was intercepted, analyzed, and quietly welcomed by human planners, because it bought time, and time was the one resource they had structured everything around. And in a facility buried deep beneath the Australian desert, Dr. Ethan Cole stood with a team of engineers as the first full-scale test of a space-time compression array stabilized without catastrophic feedback, a result that would have been impossible months earlier, and Cole allowed himself a rare smile, knowing that alien physicists had dismissed the underlying math as impractical, constrained by treaties and traditions humans had never fully accepted, and elsewhere shipyards operating under the guise of decommissioning quietly refitted hulls with systems that had no entries in any public database. Their crews sworn to silence and rotated frequently to prevent patterns from forming, and even as Dominion forces seize another human outpost, raising their banners over empty habitats, Admiral Harper addresses Inner Circle with a steady voice, reminding them that every step the enemy took deeper into human space increased their dependence on supply lines stretched across unfamiliar terrain, lines humans had mapped down to the smallest gravitic fluctuation, and as the campaign progressed, alien confidence hardened into arrogance, Dominion commanders mocking human caution in open channels, issuing ultimatums that went unanswered. And when Ambassador Laura Mitchell was summoned before the Galactic Council again, she spoke only to acknowledge the loss of another system and to request humanitarian corridors, a plea that reinforced the image of weakness, so completely that several council members privately discussed how to divide future trade concessions once humanity was formally subdued, and those discussions were recorded too, stored away as evidence of intent. And by the time the Dominion's vanguard crossed the boundary into what they believed was a final defensive ring before Earth, humanity's apparent defeat had become a foundational assumption in galactic politics, an assumption that shaped every decision the enemy made, every risk they dismissed, and every warning they ignored. And within that blind certainty, the trap waited, silent, patient, and ready to close in a way no one beyond Earth had imagined possible. The boundary the Dominion believed to be humanity's last offensive ring was a carefully curated illusion, a sparse arrangement of aging platforms, understrength patrols, and sensor nets that behaved exactly as alien analysts expected. And when the first Kethari Vanguard elements crossed it, they encountered only token resistance, a handful of human frigates that exchanged fire briefly before withdrawing in apparent disorder. And the Dominion broadcast framed the encounter as another confirmation that Earth's forces were exhausted and unwilling to commit, and across the galaxy that narrative hardened into certainty. But inside a distributed command architecture stretching from Earth orbit to hidden relays beyond charted space, the same encounter was being dissected with surgical precision, every maneuver logged, every weapon's discharge measured, every command delay timed to the microsecond. And Admiral Harper watched the data flow with an expression of quiet concentration, because the Vanguard had behaved exactly as projected, advancing aggressively, overextending formations, and relying on centralized command nodes that served them well against more conventional foes. And those nodes were now mapped so completely that human systems could predict Dominion fleet responses before orders were fully propagated. And as the enemy pushed deeper, they encountered resistance that appeared clumsy and fragmented, human units arriving late, retreating too early, or failing to exploit apparent opportunities. And those apparent mistakes were debated loudly among Dominion officers, some arguing that humanity's rapid rise had masked a shallow strategic culture, others claiming that the humans lacked the patience required for prolonged warfare, and those debates shaped decisions that played directly into human intent, drawing Dominion forces into specific corridors of space where gravitational anomalies, stellar radiation patterns, and hyperspace shear behaved in ways only long-term observation could reveal, and those corridors were laced with dormant infrastructure, devices seeded years earlier under the cover of scientific research and commercial development, devices that did nothing until activated and therefore attracted no attention. And while the Dominion celebrated another captured system, the human population was shown carefully selected footage of evacuations and defeats, leaders speaking of resilience and survival rather than victory. And the mood on Earth grew somber but resolute, because even without knowing the full truth, people sensed that something larger was unfolding, and that sense translated into compliance with rationing, acceptance of emergency measures, and a quiet determination not to break. And Colonel Marcus Hale monitored social stability metrics alongside foreign intelligence, noted with approval that morale had dipped but not fractured, because despair would have been as dangerous as premature confidence. And in the shadows of that apparent decline, humanity's most guarded projects reached maturity. Ship crews trained in simulators that modeled Dominion behavior with uncanny accuracy. Pilots rehearsing engagements they would fight only once, and at ranges no alien navy had ever considered viable. And Dr. Ethan Cole's team completed integration of space-time compression systems into hulls that outwardly resembled obsolete cruisers, their true capabilities masked by layers of deliberate inefficiency. Until the moment of activation, and as the Dominion main fleet assembled for what Archon Velcara intended to be the final demonstration of dominance, its mass casting detectable distortions across nearby systems. The Galactic Council issued statements urging humanity to accept terms before further bloodshed, statements that framed submission as mercy, and Ambassador Laura Mitchell responded with requests for time, citing internal divisions and logistical collapse, words that were replayed endlessly as proof that Earth stood on the brink. And when the Dominion fleet finally advanced in full, its commanders confident enough to broadcast their progress openly, they did so believing that every variable was known, every human weakness cataloged, and every possible resistance already factored into their plans, unaware that the very openness of their advance had stripped away the last layers of uncertainty for the people waiting for them. And as the distance between the fleets closed, as the galaxy held its breath, expecting the end of human defiance, Admiral Harper authorized a single, silent command that rippled outward through channels no alien sensor could detect, waking systems that had never fired a shot, aligning forces that had never appeared on any map, and setting in motion the phase of the trap that would turn the story of humanity's first defeat into a lesson the galaxy would never escape. When the silent command propagated through humanity's hidden network, nothing visible changed at first, and that was intentional, because the final lesson of the trap depended on timing as much as power, and so the Dominion fleet advanced unopposed for several more hours, its formations tightening as they prepared for what they believed would be a decisive engagement against the remnants of a broken enemy. And Archon Velcara observed the approach from the Vethric spire with a sense of ancient satisfaction, commenting to her advisors that the humans had at least proven useful as an example to others, and her admirals echoed that confidence, already discussing post-war administration and the division of captured resources. But beneath that confidence, human systems were coming fully alive, dormant relays synchronizing, gravity field generators aligning with stellar masses, and fleets that had been scattered across wide volumes of space adjusting position by margins so small that alien sensors dismissed them as background noise, and Admiral Harper stood as the first phase activated, not issuing speeches or dramatic declarations, but quietly confirming readiness states from commanders whose voices carried no excitement, only focus, because they understood that what came next would reshape the galaxy's understanding of war. And at the edge of the advancing Dominion formation, the first anomaly appeared, a brief distortion that caused a cluster of ships to drop from hyperspace, milliseconds earlier than planned, a trivial error by normal standards, but one that disrupted formation coherence just enough to trigger cascading micro-adjustments, and Dominion officers cursed their navigation systems and ordered recalibrations, unaware that the anomaly was not a natural fluctuation, but a deliberate compression of space-time tuned precisely to their drive profiles. And as similar distortions appeared ahead, and to the flanks the fleet slowed slightly, still confident but increasingly irritated, And it was in that moment of irritation that the first human strike landed, not as a barrage or a visible attack, but as the sudden failure of 3 Dominion command nodes whose internal clocks desynchronized by fractions of a second, enough to corrupt data streams and sever coordination, and to the alien crews it felt like confusion, orders arriving out of sequence, targeting data lagging unpredictably, and while they struggled to diagnose the issue, human ships that had seemed obsolete and underpowered revealed their true nature, slipping through compressed space corridors of positions that should have been unreachable, and they did not fire wildly but with disciplined precision, targeting engines, communication arrays, and logistics vessels rather than capital ships. And as the Dominion attempted to respond, their weapon systems found that ranges and vectors no longer matched their calculations, because the space between shooter and target was no longer behaving as expected, and panic flickered through alien command channels as losses mounted without a clear enemy to confront, and Belcara demanded explanations, her voice sharp with disbelief as reports contradicted centuries of doctrine. And in that chaos, Ambassador Laura Mitchell appeared once more before the Galactic Council, her transmission routed through channels the Dominion could not block, and she spoke calmly, stating that humanity had accepted the Council's judgment regarding Lareth. Reach, that the defeat recorded there was accurate, and that it had been necessary, and those listening struggled to understand her meaning as real-time feeds began to show the Dominion fleet fragmenting, ships colliding as formation integrity failed, supply lines severed in minutes, and then the final layer of the trap closed as human forces that had never officially existed emerged from concealment, not in overwhelming numbers but in perfect coordination, striking where the enemy was already weakest. And as the Dominions advanced ground to a halt and then reversed under forces it could not predict or counter, the galaxy watched the narrative of human weakness collapse on itself, realizing too late that the first defeat had never been a sign of failure, but an invitation, one that had drawn the most confident empire in known space into a situation from which there was no clean retreat. As the Dominion fleet attempted to disengage, the full cost of its miscalculation became impossible to hide, because retreat required coordination, and coordination was the one thing humanity had methodically stripped away. And across the distorted battlespace, Kethari captains found that every attempt to regroup only exposed another vulnerability. Hyperspace jumps misfiring by margins that placed ships inside overlapping gravity wells, emergency signals echoing back as corrupted noise, and formations dissolving into isolated clusters that human commanders treated not as targets for annihilation, but as systems to be dismantled piece by piece. And Admiral Harper maintained strict fire discipline, reminding his officers that destruction was not the objective, comprehension was. Because the lesson needed to propagate beyond the battlefield and into the political and cultural foundations of the galaxy, and so human strikes continue to focus on control, disabling reactors without, breaching hulls, severing weapon mounts, while leaving crews alive to witness the collapse of their superiority. And within the Vethric Spire, Archon Belcara watched her strategic displays fracture into incoherence, ancient symbols of Dominion dominance blinking out one by one. And for the first time in centuries, uncertainty touched her thoughts, because every doctrine she knew told her that a lesser power could not impose this kind of systemic failure without overwhelming force. And yet the data showed no such force, only precise interventions that anticipated Dominion responses before they were executed. And as her advisors argued in rising panic, she ordered a counterstrike toward Earth itself, hoping that direct pressure on the human homeworld would force a pause. But that order never reached its destination intact, intercepted and folded back through space-time in a way that delivered it simultaneously to multiple human command nodes. And Harper acknowledged it with a quiet confirmation before authorizing the next phase. And far from the battlefield, human civilian infrastructure shifted seamlessly into its wartime configuration, energy grids rebalancing, orbital habitats locking into defensive patterns, and public broadcasts interrupting regular programming with calm instructions that avoided mentioning victory or defeat, because the narrative of restraint still mattered. And as Dominion losses mounted, other galactic powers began to react, some attempting to distance themselves diplomatically, others moving fleets toward borders in anticipation of chaos. And the Galactic Council descended into disorder as representatives demanded explanations from the Kethari ambassador, whose confidence had evaporated into silence. And in that chamber, Laura Mitchell stood again, not to gloat, but to clarify, stating plainly that humanity had never sought dominion, that the trap had been built to stop an expansion that threatened countless smaller civilizations, and that the methods used were a direct response to a galaxy that equated restraint with weakness, and her words carried weight now because they were backed by undeniable evidence. Live feeds showing the once invincible Dominion fleet rendered inert, without a single planet destroyed, and as the battle stretched on, the psychological impact deepened. Dominion crews transmitting surrender requests not out of fear of death, but out of incomprehension, unable to fight an enemy that seemed to reshape the rules of reality itself, and Harper authorized selective acceptance of those surrenders, ordering humane treatment and immediate medical aid, a decision that further undermined alien assumptions about human brutality. And by the time the last coordinated Dominion resistance collapsed, the trap's purpose had been fulfilled, because the galaxy no longer saw humanity as a rising power or a failed upstart, but as something far more unsettling, a species that had chosen to lose first in order to win later, and had done so with a patience and precision that no ancient empire had anticipated. With the Dominion's forces incapacitated and scattered, the final threads of the trap tightened across the galaxy, and Admiral Harper oversaw the transition from active engagement to strategic dominance, directing human fleets to secure vital systems while avoiding unnecessary casualties. And every move was calculated to reinforce the lesson that the first defeat had never been genuine, but a prelude to mastery. And across Dominion-occupied sectors, communications remained open to allow alien commanders to observe each operation, each supply line restored or intercepted under human control, further embedding perception that humanity was organized yet fragile, cautious yet reactive, and everywhere the Dominion had predicted collapse, humanity demonstrated order, and within the council chambers of Virex Prime, panic became almost tangible, as representatives from multiple species recognized that the humans had rewritten the rules of conflict, using deception, patience, and hidden technology to neutralize an empire, and Archon Belcair's advisors presented reports describing losses in both material and psychological terms, fleets rendered immobile without destruction, commanders surrendering in disbelief, and entire supply chains neutralized without a shot fired. And in response, Belcair convened an emergency tribunal, demanding explanations, scapegoats, and immediate countermeasures. But no protocol could address the reality, because the humans had anticipated every contingency, every doctrinal assumption, and had acted with a level of foresight that no alien strategist could match. And while the Dominion's administrative corps scrambled to maintain authority, Earth and its allies quietly began integrating previously secret technologies into civilian infrastructure, orbiting platforms, activating defensive grids that appeared benign to any casual observer, and research stations that had feigned inactivity now ran simulations and production at full scale, all coordinated through secure channels that had never been compromised. And Ambassador Laura Mitchell presented further updates to the Council, emphasizing humanitarian outreach, reconstruction, and stability, while avoiding the slightest hint of triumph, reinforcing the image that humanity remained cooperative, cautious, and honorable. And the juxtaposition of these actions against the true scale of control now exercised by humans sent ripples across trade, communication, and intelligence networks. As former allies of the Dominion reconsidered allegiances, and previously neutral powers sought clarification, and back on Earth, Admiral Harper and Colonel Marcus Hale convened a final operational review, noting that the trap had achieved every objective. Alien overconfidence shattered. The first human defeat transformed into a tool of psychological and strategic domination, and the galaxy now recognized that humanity could bend perception, technology, and strategy to its will without violating moral constraints. And Dr. Ethan Cole supervised the final calibration of space-time compression arrays, knowing that these systems now serve as both deterrent and demonstration, and human pilots continued drills that simulated thousands of alien maneuvers, refining responses to scenarios that had not yet occurred, ensuring that no matter how the Dominion attempted recovery, Earth would maintain the advantage, and the public narrative remained consistent, memorials honoring those lost at Lareth, reach, speeches about endurance and unity, education campaigns teaching resilience, all carefully synchronized to reinforce patience. And as weeks passed, the Dominion attempted to regroup, fleets reorganized, systems reoccupied, but each action was countered by humans who seemed to act with prescience, shutting down key nodes, intercepting communications, and in some cases simply waiting for the alien commanders to make predictable errors. And slowly, the reality crystallized across the galaxy. The first human defeat had not been a loss, but a carefully orchestrated maneuver that allowed humanity to expose weaknesses, draw on overconfidence, and establish unassailable superiority, a lesson both tactical and philosophical. And as Admiral Harper observed the aftermath, he knew the galaxy had learned something that no council, doctrine, or historian would ever forget. Never underestimate humans. Never assume surrender signifies weakness. And never disregard patience as a weapon, because humanity had taken its first official defeat and transformed it into a trap the galaxy could never escape. With the Dominion incapacitated and the wider galaxy watching in disbelief, humanity began the final stage of asserting control, not through overwhelming destruction but through precise, disciplined consolidation, and every movement was calculated to demonstrate that what seemed like weakness was in fact strategy, as human fleets secured critical junctions, repair crews restored infrastructure faster than expected, and communication networks were re-established under human oversight without alien interference. And across Virex Prime and other Council worlds, representatives could only watch as their assumptions crumbled, realizing that the first human defeat had been an engineered event designed to manipulate perception and lure them into overextension. And Admiral Harper coordinated a synchronized network of operations that stretched across dozens of systems, each action reinforcing the lesson of restraint, patience, and calculated force, while Ambassador Laura Mitchell continued diplomatic engagements that outwardly emphasized cooperation, humanitarian aid, and rebuilding, a facade that masked the total control humanity now exercised, and within Dominion-held sectors alien crews, previously confident in their numerical and technological superiority, discovered that supply lines had been severed, navigation systems subtly corrupted, and communications intercepted with such precision that every attempt at independent action risked immediate exposure. And as panic spread, through command structures, Archon Velcara realized that her centuries of experience and doctrine had been rendered obsolete by a species she considered primitive, and in that moment the full scope of human planning became clear. Every apparent loss, every retreat, every measured response had been a deliberate part of a trap designed not only to protect humanity, but to teach the galaxy a lesson it would never forget. And back on Earth, the population remained unaware of the full scale of operations, mourning the lives lost at Lareth Reach while continuing daily life, because public perception had been carefully managed to maintain morale and prevent destabilization. And within hidden command centers, Admiral Harper, Colonel Marcus Hale, Dr. Ethan Cole, Commander Alicia Grant, and their teams monitored the final phases with meticulous attention, ensuring that every Dominion asset was either neutralized, controlled, or contained, and as the last pockets of organized resistance collapsed, the Galactic Council convened emergency sessions to assess the aftermath, only to find that the humans had reshaped the balance of power without a single planetary system being destroyed unnecessarily. And the message reverberated throughout the galaxy, a realization that no species, regardless of size, age, or assumed technological advantage, could underestimate humanity's combination of patience, ingenuity, and strategic foresight. And as fleets returned to control positions, supply chains reactivated under human oversight, and alien governments scrambled to renegotiate treaties and trade agreements on terms dictated by Earth, Admiral Harper allowed himself a rare moment of reflection, knowing that the first human defeat had not been a tragedy but a masterstroke, a trap so complete that the galaxy could never escape its lesson. And as the stars themselves seemed to witness the outcome, humanity's legacy was cemented, underestimated, challenged, and dismissed at first. Yet through discipline, foresight, and unwavering resolve, humans had demonstrated that true strength often lies not in overwhelming force, but in the ability to outthink, outweight, and outmaneuver every expectation placed upon them, leaving the galaxy forever changed, forever aware that humanity's first defeat had been nothing of the sort, but rather the beginning of an era in which the underestimated species had seized control of its destiny and shown that no trap, no matter how carefully prepared, could ever be sprung upon them without consequence.